Hello, everyone. Mattice Zundel here. Excited to have you join me today for this brand new webinar that we're offering on understanding workplace bullying, specifically for workplace investigators. And this webinar was inspired by the fact that lately I've been getting a lot of referrals from investigators who are getting called in to do hostile work environment complaints, and then they realize that while the behavior wasn't aimed at any sort of protected class, so it's not technically legally a hostile work environment, they do see that people feel that the environment is indeed hostile and this person's behavior does need to change. So we'll talk more about differences and similarities between harassment and bullying. But that's what investigators seem to be finding these days is a complaint of harassment. Turns out it's not harassment, it's more like workplace bullying. And the organization still needs to step in and put a stop to it, even though the behavior is legal. So just to introduce myself a little bit, again, I'm Mattice Zundel. I have been researching, studying, publishing, speaking, training, everything you can imagine on the topic of workplace bullying for over a decade. And I've been doing that because I was the director of human resources for a nonprofit organization where we did have a bully. And, I just experienced a lot of the problems this person created as the organization representative, right? So I experienced a lot of turnover in this person's department. I spent a lot of time counseling this person, counseling people who were complaining to me, and I just wasn't ever able to make any headway. In addition to dealing with this as an organizational representative, as the HR director, I was also dealing with this as a target. I myself felt bullied. And so that compounded the problem. During all of this time, I started getting my master's degree at San Diego State and started researching this topic because I wanted to understand it. So I really made it my focus in grad school. And my master's degree is in organizational communication. So it was a neat school because I was able to sort of study whatever I wanted and however I wanted, and so did a lot of surveys and researching and writing on this topic. I wrote my thesis on the topic of workplace bullying and have just continued down that path for the last decade. Once I got out of grad school, pretty quickly thereafter, I wrote the book Back Off that you see on the left there, and that book was me trying to help people who feel like they're targets of bullying really understand the logistics behind how to get out of it. And there's worksheets in there regarding how to talk to HR, and there's tips in there in terms of things you should know and things you should be thinking about before you go into your meetings with HR. There's some tips for communicating with bullies. So really tried to give some very clear advice. My second book, Seeking Civility, came out a little more recently. That one's a few years old. And Seeking Civility is a book for leaders, managers, and HR on essentially my 10-step methodology for resolving workplace bullying. I'm also a regular contributor to Forbes through the Forbes Coaches Council. Since getting out of grad school, I've had the opportunity to be featured in quite a few places as an expert, so that's been pretty fun. And I've also served a huge array of clients ranging from Fortune 500s like Chevron on down to a tiny little 22-person bank in the middle of nowhere. I've worked with government and military and universities and for-profits, nonprofits, and everything in between. So really have seen it all. So today, my investigators, we're going to talk about a few different things. I want to really give you a definition around workplace bullying so that you have a clear understanding of what it means and looks like. And we'll talk about some examples of behaviors. We'll talk about bullying versus harassment versus violence and how those behaviors are intertwined. I'll give you a social model of negativity because a lot of times I think we really focus on the perpetrator of these types of behaviors, but really negativity is a social problem and needs to be represented as a social model. So my goal with that is to help you in giving recommendations as part of your reports at the end of your investigations to kind of talk about this from a culture standpoint, and it's not just this one person. And then we'll get into the mind of workplace bullies and talk about why they act that way. I want to share a coaching method that I use to help these individuals change their behavior. I'll give you some tips on questions for your investigation, and I'll talk to you about how targets talk, because I think sometimes investigators get, and even HR, they get stuck trying to understand if this is conflict, is it bullying, is it harassment, what is it? And people who feel bullied actually use very specific metaphors. And so I wanted to share those with you as well. So let's go ahead and define bullying, and wanted to first give you this term, abrasive leaders. So there's a lot of people out there who just say bullies. These are bullies. This person's a bully. And really using that word, we try to use the word abrasive leaders because it's a little more polite. We can't be name calling. So just wanted to kind of introduce you to that term. When I'm talking about somebody who engages in workplace bullying behaviors, I'm talking about an abrasive leader. So abrasive leaders are anybody who's charged with authority whose interpersonal behavior causes emotional distress in coworkers that's sufficient enough to disrupt organizational functioning. And again, we're often seeing this phrase, workplace bullies, but really we're going to stick to the word abrasive leaders. So let's talk about what bullying is. Now, there are a ton of definitions online about workplace bullying, and in the academic world, there are also a ton of definitions. Researchers haven't yet come to a real clear agreement on what workplace bullying means, or what it is, or what's the real clear way to define it. So what I'm going to do is give you a couple of concepts that are in any definition of workplace bullying, no matter what definition you're reading. So the first concept you'll see in any definition is that it's repeated. So workplace bullying is ongoing, it's pervasive, it gets more and more frequent over time, it gets more and more aggressive over time. So similar to harassment, which can be one egregious act. Usually when we're talking about harassment, we're talking about a series of events over time, and same with bullying. Certainly there could be one egregious act that could be bullying, but usually we're talking about something that's happening over time. Researchers who quantify things, of course, to study them, they would say that bullying happens about once a week for a period of 6 months. Now, that's not, the requirement for it to count as bullying. That's just to give you an idea of what we're talking about when we're saying repeated. The next piece of the definition that you'll always see is that bullying creates a psychological power imbalance. And this is what makes bullying separate from conflict. So in conflict, you have two people. They both disagree, but they both feel the opportunity to be heard. They both feel like they're able to say their side and share their point of view. And in bullying, you have one person whose behavior is so loud and angry and abrasive and abusive that they're squashing out the other person. And that's when that scale tips over to it being workplace bullying. Certainly, conflict can escalate into bullying if the conflict doesn't get resolved. But bullying and conflict in and of themselves are not the same. So what happens is you have two individuals, the abrasive leader and the target, and at some point in their relationship, the abrasive leader says something or does something that's more of a microaggression. So maybe this abrasive leader fires off a mean email or makes a snarky comment in a staff meeting, and nobody says anything about it. And so this abrasive leader sort of gets the subconscious green light that it's okay to do that. And then they'll do it again, and they do it again, and they do it again. So over time, this behavior gets more and more frequent and more aggressive. So bullying isn't something that just happens. It creeps in just like something like harassment might. The problem is that there is a ton of research out there that this causes a lot of damage to both targets and the people watching it happen. So this is the third piece of our definition that you'll always see in any definition of bullying. People who feel like they're being squashed out, people who feel like they're being abused at work, ultimately experience quite a bit of harm. So there's about 40 years of academic research on the topic of workplace bullying. It started in 1983 was the first article published on it. And I would say at this point, about 80% of the research on workplace bullying in the academic world is focused on the targets and the kind of damage it causes. People at the receiving end of this abusive behavior at work are anxious, depressed, sad, lonely because nobody understands what they're going through. They go home to their spouse and their spouse doesn't get it. And the spouse says, well, why don't you just quit? So they're feeling very lonely. Lots of research proving that workplace bullying can actually cause PTSD. And I myself have experienced situations with clients where somebody committed suicide even as a result of being bullied. So this is extraordinarily damaging for people to be at the receiving end of. Witnesses also experience these things, though not to the same extent. So if I'm at work witnessing aggression around me, I might not be quite as anxious, but certainly I'm anxious because I don't want to be next. Certainly I'm losing loyalty to my company because I'm wondering why managers aren't stepping in. Certainly my work product goes down while I'm focused on avoiding this workplace bully or abrasive leader. So, there's nothing good that's coming out of this. The last definition piece here is that this is all, of course, very expensive for an organization. People at the receiving end, again, are producing less work, it's less quality, customer service is suffering, the list goes on and on. So while definitions are nice, let's talk about bullying behaviors. Now, something I noticed in my years of doing this is that every survey that researches workplace bullying or tries to understand it, and every list out there online that names off the laundry list of bullying behaviors, I noticed that all of those behaviors always fall into one of three buckets. So here are the three buckets to be looking for in doing your investigations around workplace bullying or a hostile work environment. Bucket number one is aggressive communication. Things that you can see, nasty emails, getting in someone's personal space, harsh kind of body language, harsh finger pointing, making facial expressions that appear very abusive and aggressive. So for example, one individual that I coached who was engaging in bullying behaviors, in staff meetings, he would actually stand up and sort of rise up, and people described it like this Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde thing that would happen, where as he was getting out of his chair, his chest was puffing up, his eyes were starting to bulge, the vein in his forehead was starting to pop, and then he'd lean over the table and say something pretty nasty to somebody else. And so all of that, felt very aggressive in his body language. Certainly this could be angry outbursts. So this is anything that you can see that we can all point to and say that was aggressive. The next bucket of behavior is humiliation. So these are behaviors that leave the target feeling socially isolated, humiliated, embarrassed. So for example, pointing out mistakes in public, sending out emails regarding mistakes and CCing half the office, socially isolating someone, leaving them out of happy hours or events, not inviting them to meetings that they should be invited to, making fun of somebody, taunting them on social media, hazing or playing harsh jokes or harsh sarcasm. So those are the sorts of behaviors that would count as humiliation. The last bucket is manipulation, and this is the one that makes workplace bullying so hard. So in something like, and even harassment, I mean, you're the investigators, it can be hard to really understand what's happening, and certainly there are forms of manipulation in harassment and hostile work environment complaints. Some of the things that I've seen in workplace bullying, for example, is one woman was filing a complaint with the EEOC. She ultimately felt like she was being bullied, and that it wasn't necessarily because of her race, but because she was one of the only African-American people in her office. She went down that route of filing a complaint with the EEOC because she had that fact that she was African-American on her side. She was one of the few in her office, but really she was being bullied. It wasn't, she felt she wasn't being treated that way because of her race. It was just that, she was being bullied. So what was going on here is this woman worked in an office where they had everyone in her office had around 30 case files, and she was assigned much more work than that. So everyone else was working at the rate of 30 case files. Maybe they had 35, maybe they had 28, but they were always right around 30. Her boss would give her 60, and then 50, and then 20, and then 30, and then 60 again. And so her boss was really toying with her workload, of course, making it difficult to function, because how can you function if you don't know what's expected of you? And part of this was that she was going to her manager quite a bit and saying, I need you to even it all out. I can't do this. Everybody else is only doing 30. Why am I doing so much? And the manager just kept saying, well, you've been here the longest, you know, you can do it. And then when her performance review time came around, she was told that she was unable to keep up with the demands of her workload and was being recommended for a demotion. So this is an example of manipulation. Now, that by itself, we can't really point to and say that's bullying or harassment. You know, that's maybe poor management, but not harassment. But that behavior was coupled with some other things like pointing out mistakes in public and sort of publicly berating her. So there were other things happening, but that was one of the behaviors that she was experiencing. So manipulation are things like manipulating someone's workload, giving them poor performance reviews when in fact they're not, you know, they are performing well. It's not about their performance. Leaving people out of information that they need to have. So if there's 5 steps to accomplish something, but I only give you 3 steps, now you're being set up to fail. So it's really using the workload and the tools the organization gives this individual to bully. Now, again, all of this is very damaging for people at the receiving end. So people who feel bullied experience a huge array of emotions. They're lost and confused, anxious, depressed. Of course, they're discouraged. They're calling in sick. I read one research article that people who feel bullied actually call in sick 10 more days per year than people who do not feel bullied. They're spending a lot of time talking about being bullied and being frustrated by it and distracted by it. And meanwhile, all of these other things are going down. Quality of work is going down, safety. I had one individual, one of the ways that he was engaging in workplace bullying is by forcing the janitors to clean these ovens at 400 degrees Fahrenheit. So they were a manufacturing company and they were melting aluminum, and you know this bully or abrasive leader would say that needs to be cleaned. We don't have time to let it cool, and forcing people to clean things at 400 degrees. So he was violating people's safety. Of course, people can't communicate. They, the company's reputation goes down, and all of this is damaging to the bottom line. So let's talk about harassment versus violence, and then I'm going to open up for questions. I'm curious to hear how you're all feeling. So wanted to give you this high-level overview first. Now, I know you're investigators, and you have to draw the line in the sand between harassment and bullying and violence. But I just wanted to throw some food for thought out there for you. If you read the definition of harassment on the EEOC's website and remove the part about the protected classes, which is what I've done, you can see that harassment and bullying are actually the same thing. So bullying is about enduring conduct that becomes a condition of employment. People who feel bullied believe that they're required to put up with this if they want to keep their job. And often they feel that way because they can see that nobody's stepping in to help them. And of course, we can all agree that workplace bullying is intimidating, hostile, and abusive. So what I'm getting at is harassment and workplace bullying are a lot more similar than we give them credit for. And I see other people giving webinars about kind of how different they are and all this stuff. They're not. The behaviors are exactly the same. The behaviors are exactly the same. As I mentioned, for example, that woman who filed a complaint with the EEOC, she was being bullied. She was not being bullied because of her race, but because she was of a certain race, she was able to file a harassment complaint. And I've had several employment law attorneys actually tell me they've seen that as well. If we look at violence, OSHA describes violence as a range from threats and verbal abuse to physical assaults and homicide. So, of course, verbal abuse is part of being bullied. So wanted to give you a couple examples here. So one individual that I coached was really known for these crazy angry outbursts among other bullying behaviors that he engaged in. And one thing he would do is just kind of freak out on people, and he'd get in their personal space and his face would turn red. And he had been doing that for years. Well, one day he yelled so egregiously at somebody that this person had a panic attack. And they told their friends there in the workplace that while they were being yelled at, their tongue, it was his tongue was swelling up. And he commented to his friends at work there that he felt like if this individual, the abrasive leader who was yelling, if he had gone to punch this guy who was being yelled at, he told his friends there was no way he could have ran. He felt like his legs were frozen. And so while he was being yelled at, he was wondering if this person was going to lose it and punch him. And he was having a panic attack. So that was what inspired the organization to reach out to me. Now, we could say, well, it was only violence that one time because of this guy's reaction. He had a panic attack and he was so afraid that now it's sort of violence. But just because everyone else had been able to tolerate it up until that point, it doesn't make it that one time the only time it was workplace violence. Any time that he yelled and had these crazy angry outbursts, that counts as workplace violence. And so I really do, and I know as investigators, you kind of do have to draw a line in the sand as part of what you're there to do. But I encourage you to start thinking about this a little different. I'm just curious what your thoughts are on this. Is this resonating with you? Do you agree with me? Do you feel like, no, Catherine, we absolutely have to, draw that line in the sand? What do you think? Go ahead and type your answers in the questions. I'm going to take a sip of water while you do that. I've got one person saying this makes sense. Someone says, I didn't realize how similar bullying and harassment are. Okay, all right, so let's keep going. So just to look at this a little bit deeper, here are the similarities between harassment and bullying. Harassment and bullying are both about abuse of power. Harassment and bullying are both usually repeated, though one egregious act counts. In terms of intention, it's sort of irrelevant. So in the law regarding harassment, it even clearly says it doesn't have to be intentional. You don't have to prove it was intentional in order to prove it happened. You just have to prove that it happened. Similar to bullying. So there is a lot of stuff out there claiming that workplace bullying is an intentional behavior. The states that have laws around workplace bullying like to include that word malicious in there. So for example, in California, we've included the word malicious in abusive conduct, but it's not intentional. So as somebody who coaches these individuals, I can tell you that it is not intentional. So the reason there's all this information out there claiming it is intentional is that previous to about 5 or 6 years ago, we didn't really understand as researchers how to get access to people who bully. We were focused on targets and collecting information from the target side. And so, of course, targets feel like it's intentional. So we were hearing from targets, it's intentional, these people are evil and awful. And so that's what researchers were saying about it, that it was intentional. But it's only, again, been in the last 5 or 6 years that we've really started actually talking to people who bully and finding out from them that it's actually not intentional. Both of these behaviors ruin lives. Really, the one and true difference is that harassment is illegal and bullying is legal. So if you bully everyone, that is legal. If you bully only a certain race or religion, etc., then that's illegal. So let's have a look at violence. So violence, similarities to bullying, both, again, about abuse of power. Both cause fear and anxiety in the targets. Both are about intimidation. Both can ruin lives. And again, violence is illegal, but workplace bullying is legal. And I have a nice long list of overlapping behaviors if you'd like it for future investigations. A woman by the name of Sue Hoffman from Workplace Guardians and I put it together, and we really put our heads together to understand the similarities here. And so I have a nice list of that kind of breaks down these things a little bit deeper. If you're interested in it, send us an email. Okay, so let's talk about the fact that this stuff is all social. So it's important to take in the fact that, you know, we should not always be so focused on just the perpetrator. And I encourage you, when you're talking with employers about next steps after you do an investigation, that, you know, it's not just about training or updating your policy or sending someone to training. It's really a social phenomenon. The reason bullying and harassment happen is that the organization has allowed it to. And so let's look at that. So of course, first up is the perpetrator. They're part of this social phenomenon. People who engage in harassment and bullying often have no social and emotional intelligence and are lacking communication skills. They lack the ability to manage their stress. They are seeking power. They like to do things that make them feel powerful. So there are certainly some perpetrator characteristics here. Now, targets are also part of the scenario. I'm not saying that targets are deserving of the way that they're treated or anything like that, absolutely not. But targets are engaging in a relationship a relationship with this perpetrator through their work. And so targets are part of the equation. People who are at the receiving end of harassment and bullying, one of their defining factors is they've been unable to speak up for themselves in a way that resonated with the perpetrator. And that's sort of the one defining factor there. So again, their relationship is one of power and balance. But let's bring in the organizational members. So a lot of my colleagues would say organizational members are bystanders or witnesses, and that's the phrase that they use. I don't like those words, because I think they seem very passive. So if you're a bystander to a car accident, that makes sense. You can't do anything about the car accident. You can't step in front of it and stop it. So in that instance, you are a bystander or a witness. But if you're at work witnessing harassment or bullying happening around you and you don't say anything, that makes you a reinforcer. So I think it's important for all of us to start thinking of ourselves as reinforcers if we're not stepping in when we see bad things happen. So by not saying anything, these reinforcers are supporting the perpetrator and damaging the target. On the other side is the organizational norms, stressors, and culture. So there's actually probably the other biggest body of research from workplace bullying is around the organization and what the organization's doing to allow bullying to thrive. And what they have found is that organizations with workplace bullying and harassment have certain things in common. They're bureaucratic. They have a lot of rules. They have strict hierarchy. That's what we mean by bureaucratic. There's a lot of smart people. You have a lot of people who have worked there for a long time. It's a high stress environment. The organization's going through change. There's weak leadership, which means leaders aren't willing to step in to put a stop to the behavior. These are all the kinds of factors that organizations may have that could lend themselves to allowing harassment and bullying to thrive. So the organization is supporting the perpetrator and damaging the target. Meanwhile, the perpetrator is damaging the organization and damaging the organization's members. So the relationship is not mutual. Okay, so let's talk about why abrasive leaders act this way. Let's get into their head a little bit. Why do people engage in workplace bullying? Well, the common assumptions are that these individuals are fully aware of their behavior, that their focus is to harm people, and that there's no way they can change. That's what most people think. But in reality, these people are actually fully unaware of their behavior. Their intention is actually to get the job done, and they are indeed coachable. So just to give you some examples, one individual that I coached, the first time that I met with him, his name was Joe, we were talking about coaching and kind of where we were at, and his employer had told them that he was on his last straw. If he couldn't address his behavior and make a change, he was going to be out. They were going to let him go. And so when we met to talk about coaching, what he said to me was, I wish that they had told me sooner. I've been walking around like an asshole for 3 years and nobody told me. Why did they let it get to this point? I wish, they had been talking to me, and still, instead of getting to this point where they're making this crazy, ultimatum that if I don't change, I'm out. What was interesting about this comment was that he had been told many times that his behavior wasn't working. He had had people transfer out of his office or out of his department. He'd had many sit downs with his manager. When I spoke to his manager actually cried because he was so upset by the fact that he had not been able to address Joe's behavior. So he had been told many times, but he wasn't taking it in. And this is a real clear example of being fully unaware of his behavior. So a lot of times I think managers in HR feel like, well, I've told him or her, and they're not getting it. They're still acting that way. So obviously it is intentional, but that's not the deal. Another example, another individual that I coached, this is what he said to me when we met. He said, I'm just managing the way that I'm managed. You should see what happens in my C-suite meetings. So he was the CTO of a Fortune 500 company and had been in the company for many, many years. He was like the 8th employee, and now they had 5,000 employees. And he was just sort of acting in the way he'd always acted. And he was actually a little bit bothered, or a lot bothered, by the fact that he was the only one getting coaching. He wondered why the other members of C-suite weren't getting coaching too. He's like, I'm just acting like them. Why am I being pinned down on this? And the reason was that he was the one who had crossed the line to the extent that somebody was filing a hostile work environment complaint. So even though all of those C-suite people may act that way, he was the one who had the complaint, and so they called me in to coach him. In terms of intention, so if we were to say that people who engage in workplace bullying are doing it intentionally, and then what we'd be saying is their goal is to make people uncomfortable and unhappy, and it's all purposeful. And I just haven't seen that. What I see is that people who bully, or these abrasive leaders, they have a strong desire to be seen as uber competent, and so they live in fear of being seen as incompetent. And it's a little bit crazy because everybody is living in fear of them, and meanwhile they are living in fear of being seen as incompetent. And so everybody is walking around on eggshells, abrasive leader included. The other factor that comes into play here is they have a very low social and emotional intelligence. And those two factors cause them to engage in bullying. So anything that threatens their competence causes them to lash out. And because they have low social and emotional intelligence, they are having a hard time understanding the damage that they cause. So where you might yell at somebody and you can see that their facial expression changes and that you might have hurt their feelings, people who engage in bullying don't see that. They miss all of that. And so they're blind as bats. So just to kind of drive this point home and highlight it, there are two factors that drive people to engage in bullying behaviors. They're seeking uber competence. They really want people to see them that way, and they're really lacking social and emotional intelligence, and that's what causes the bullying behaviors. So another way to look at this is for us to dig deep and go back to our 7th grade science classes. Now, you may remember in 7th grade that you talked about fight or flight. So think about this. Back in the old days, if you were walking through the forest and you came across a bear, you'd see that bear as a threat, and that bear would cause anxiety in you, which would cause you to go into defense. And as you probably remember from science class in elementary school, that means that you engaged in fight or flight. So this is an instinct that we very much have had our entire lifetime of humans being around. So we see something as a threat, it causes anxiety, and that anxiety causes us to go into defense mode, and we either fight or flee. And so that's inspired by the adrenaline rush, right? Well, fighting and fleeing isn't something that just our old nomad selves did. We still fight and flee now as humans in the office. So what happens is you have my slide is stuck. You have this abrasive leader, and they are threatened by incompetence. They have this uber desire to be seen as competent, and they are threatened by anything that feels incompetent to them. That causes them to feel anxiety, and they engage in fighting or fleeing, of course, mostly fighting because they are abrasive, and that's the route they go. But then you can flip it and also look at this through the eyes of a target. The target sees this individual, the abrasive leader, as a threat. It causes them to experience anxiety, and targets also fight or flee. So targets might fight by going to HR and filing a complaint, or banding together, or talking to another manager about it. So in their own way, they're fighting, or they flee. And fleeing looks like avoidance. They don't email this person, they stay away from this person. That's their version of flight. And what's interesting about all of this is managers are also fleeing. So, again, a lot of times when I get these calls, these are people who have been acting this way for years. It's just that they finally crossed the line and finally had a hostile work environment complaint filed, or something finally happened that caused HR to say, okay, we have to step in. And so that the employee who files the hostile work environment complaint can usually inspire managers to do something, at the very least have an investigation. But it's up to investigators to recognize that even if they discover it's workplace bullying and not a legal, technical, hostile work environment, that it's still behavior that needs to be addressed. And I have spoken to many, many targets who filed a hostile work environment complaint. An investigator came in and said it was not a hostile work environment because it was not about a protected characteristic, and then nothing happened. This person was just forced to go back to work as if nothing had happened, which is just not the right opportunity, not the right way to go about this, right? So let's talk about coaching a little bit here. And so my coaching program is really based around this model. And in fact, I go through this model through a whole half-hour lesson plan to get through all of this for the abrasive leader. And ultimately, what we talk about is that we are not our old nomad selves. And although fight and flight is still something that we very much engage in now, the extra piece that we've added in becoming more and more like us is working through this. So we have the ability to, work through anxiousness. I have the ability as a coach to the abrasive leader to help them work through their own anxieties. And through our work, the abrasive leader is able to help the employees work through their anxieties. So let's talk about coaching. This is an option. This is something that you can offer up your clients when you discover that there is workplace bullying. And actually, I also coach people who've been accused of harassment. Right now, I have two clients. One was accused of sexual harassment, the other of making some comments about somebody's mother. So it was sort of hostile work environment stuff. So, coaching is an option for these individuals. So just to share a little bit about it, I have been trained in a method created by a woman by the name of Dr. Laura Crawshaw. And Dr. Crawshaw has been researching coaching for over 40 years, and she has coached almost 500 abrasive leaders in her career. And what she did was really figure out this very specific methodology to coaching. And if you follow this methodology, it really does seem to make a difference. So coaching is focused around three questions. What are the negative perceptions? What's causing them? And what strategies can we develop to eliminate the negative perceptions? So through answering this first question around what are the negative perceptions, what I do in my first meeting with my coachee is to talk about the coaching and find out how they're feeling. And often they'll say, I don't really even understand what's going on. I don't know what's going on with my behavior or what the deal is. I've been acting like this way forever, right? So I'll say, well, you know what? Let's try to understand this together. Why don't you let me interview some peers and subordinates to find out what the negative perceptions are? Let's find out why I'm here. And I'll ask them for the names of 8 to 10 people that I can interview. And they make an email introduction for me, and then I'm able to interview these 10 people. I also get names from HR to interview additional parties. And I interview all of these people, and I ask actually just one question, so it's not a 360, it's literally just one question that I ask. And then I collect all of this feedback, and you can see the feedback here. This is from somebody that I coached. These are actual pages from his feedback. And you can see the kinds of themes I get, that this person's intimidating, they have poor emotional control, they're aggressive. So people give me all of their feedback, and I divvy it up and put it into themes so that we can really understand what is it that people are really seeing in you. And then we go through answering the other two questions, which is what's causing these perceptions and how can we eliminate them. So I actually go through that feedback with my coaching client, and then through our coaching sessions, these are the two questions. Why do people feel this way, and how can we eliminate them? So that usually takes me about 3 to 4 months of coaching. So at the start of the coaching program, these are the kinds of things I'm getting. So we go through the feedback, and then we'll say, okay, well, one of your themes is aggressive body language. And they'll say, well, I don't get it. Why do they think my body language is aggressive? And I say, well, I don't know. Why do you think that is? What do you think? And a lot of times they'll say, well, you're the expert, you tell me. And of course, I have to force them to give me some answers. But these are a lot of times their theories. They'll say, well, they're probably just sensitive, or they're millennials. What do they know? Or I don't know, you tell me, I don't know. And so they just really have no idea why their body language is seen as aggressive. Through those 3 to 4 months, through coaching, we're able to change their point of view. So they'll start, I don't get it. Why do they think my body language is aggressive? And I'll say, well, I don't know. You tell me. And then they'll come up with this other theory. Now I get it. I'm in their personal space. I guess I could stay seated. So they come to realize that there are things that they're doing that are causing people to perceive certain things, and that there are things they can do to adjust those perceptions. So they go from being very poor empathizers to being very insightful as we go through the process of answering those questions. What are the negative perceptions? Why are they there? And how can we eliminate them? And what happens is that after 3 or 4 months, depending on how the person's doing, I re-interview all of those people I interviewed the first time around. And the feedback I get is much more positive. So you can see this is the same person's actual pages from their feedback interviews, where people were saying this individual is more self-aware, they're more contributing rather than controlling, they're more collaborative. So it's really a cool process to watch this individual learn to tone it down, to take down their abrasive behaviors. Some of the comments I've heard from my coachees, one person said, I feel like I've grown so much, even my daughter says I'm much more in control. Another one was this CTO of the Fortune 500 company. He said to me, I feel like it's okay to be human. And what he meant by that was, it's okay to not be perfect. I don't have to focus so much on being seen as so competent. It's okay if my team makes a mistake. So let's talk about some questions for your investigation. And I am not an investigator, I'm not an attorney, but as an outsider looking in, these are the questions that I recommend you ask if you're trying to understand harassment versus bullying. So if you were to ask a question around, tell me about the strengths and weaknesses of your leader, your manager, and your team, people will most certainly come out with all sorts of juicy information about the bullying if that is indeed what's happening. Another question, has anyone at this company ever treated you in a manner that you felt violated your right to fair employment? Have you observed such behavior against others? So they don't necessarily need to know that there are legalities around fair employment practices, just like hostile work environment. They don't necessarily know that it's a legal term. They just know it feels hostile. They just know that bullying feels unfair, right? So this is another great question. You certainly want to find out if people would feel comfortable telling or if they fear retaliation. And then another great open-ended question is, tell me about the climate. And I've just found in asking these kinds of questions, people really do open up about all of the terrible things happening to them. So wanted to share with you what the research has found targets say when they're talking about workplace bullying. So first up, this all actually comes from research from 2006, actually. There were several researchers, Tracy and Lucan Sandvik. They had people write out their stories, and then we're really looking at the metaphors people used. And what they found is that targets who are describing workplace bullying talk about the process of being bullied and the process of trying to talk to HR about it, using this kind of overarching metaphor of a nightmare or a battle. So these are words that came straight out of the stories that these researchers had collected. And I have heard very similar metaphors on my own as well. So people feel beat down, they feel like they're abused, they feel like they're in a war, this person's playing games with them. So what I'm saying is, as you're talking to people, if they feel bullied, they'll likely use metaphors in line with this kind of nightmare battle sort of a thing. The next thing is that these targets describe the abrasive leader using metaphors under this umbrella of evil or dictatorship. And they'll say things like, this person seems like they're possessed, they're evil, they're a dictator, they're a narcissistic dictator, they're power hungry, I feel like I work with Hitler. And these are all things that these researchers found in their article, and also I have heard myself in doing my investigations or my interviews. The last piece here was the way targets describe themselves in the process of bullying, and they talk mostly about feeling like they're captive. So and I have heard that first one, trapped in an abusive relationship, many, many, many times. People really feel like, people have said to me, I feel like this is what it must be like to be in a domestic violent kind of a situation. Where they just feel like they're trapped in this abusive relationship. Targets use metaphors like slaves. I feel like I'm this person's personal servant. I feel like I'm doing time, or I'm in prison. So as you're taking in information around your complaints that you're investigating, these are the metaphors you can be listening for. So with that, happy to open it up to any questions if anybody has any. And of course, I'm happy to chat with you more about any specific situations you may come across. Happy to help in any way that I can. But there is my email address. Does anybody have any questions about anything? Let's see, one question. Do you have something I can send my clients? I do, Carla. If you send me an email at info@civilitypartners.com, I will send you a link. I actually have a little 5-minute video kind of explaining the coaching process, so happy to send that to you. Any other questions about anything before we pop off here? All right, well, thank you so much. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for that compliment. I appreciate it. Someone says, very insightful. Thank you. You all have a wonderful rest of your day. I appreciate you spending your time with me. Shoot me an email if you need anything.